Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, April 11th, 1866, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded by a man named Henry Bergh. We are going to refer to it as the ASPCA from here on out. Bergh had visited Britain's Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And, you can kind of think of this moment as a bit of a culmination of a big evolution of ideas around the treatment of animals, both in the commercial sphere, animals being used as labor, and in the domestic sphere, animals as companions and pets. Over the course of the 19th century, there was a growing understanding and debate and argument that the way we treat animals is a reflection of larger societal questions about morality, labor, and so forth. It is really fascinating stuff, and we also get to talk about animals on the show. So here to do that is, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And as we were putting together this segment, we thought to ourselves, we should get someone who just really loves dogs and who is like a well-known dog lover. And our special guest, Anne Helen Petersen, came to mind. She's an amazing author of many things, including a new newsletter called Culture Study, which I subscribe to and is really fantastic. So, Anne, thank you for doing this, and thank you for heeding the dog lover call.
Of course. I mean, you didn't mention my dogs, but...
Yes, well, that was my next question, was prove your bona fides as a dog lover.
I have 2 dogs that are somewhat internet famous. One is named Peggy, and she's a junkyard rescue. Like, that's just what she looks like. She also has 3 legs, so her nickname is 3-Leg Pegs. We named her Peggy before she lost her leg. But she is very resilient and wonderful. And then our second dog is a black and white English setter style mix. And his name is Steve. He's also a very good dog.
Yeah. Great. Well, Peggy and Steve will get shout outs throughout the show. Niki, Kellie, do either of you own dogs or pets? Or?
I used to have a dog. I used to have a dog named Tito. He was a chocolate lab. We got him because he was one of 5 male pups, and since my last name is Jackson, Tito Jackson.
There you go.
It just felt perfect. He was great, and then we had to give him to a friend because New York City living with the chocolate lab was just not working.
That's a lot, yeah. And I am about to become a new puppy mommy, so in a few weeks we might have to pause recordings just to quiet down the new addition to the family.
I am looking forward to that.
Oh, so exciting. I love dogs.
And I guess I will shout out my cat, Archie, who actually just recently, unfortunately, passed away. I'm sorry to say. It's a bummer. I know I'm sorry to do that at the top of the show, but Archie lived a very good life, was mildly internet famous for a little bit. There was actually a feature about Archie in New York Magazine way back when, but yes, I miss him. We are now plotting, all 3 of us in our household, about our next cats, and so it's very exciting. We have all proven our bona fides here.
Our loyalties.
But you know what? There is actually even more reason and more expertise among us, because Niki, it turns out, you wrote your undergrad thesis about the ASPCA. Is that right?
It is not right, but it is close to right. Okay. I wrote my master's thesis on the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which actually comes out of the ASPCA in some really fascinating ways that I'm now going to tell you about.
Yes, that is amazing. So let's actually start there, because I want to actually start with these big ideas about kind of morality and cruelty and so forth. I mentioned in the intro that the founding of the ASPCA was a bit of a culmination of some thinking over the course of decades and a century in the 19th century about morality, cruelty, etc. Sort of paint that landscape for us.
Yeah, there's something really interesting happening in the late 19th century in the U.S., which is, there's some thinking going on that if you solve some problems around vice and around cruelty that's happening within homes, you'll actually be able to solve a lot of bigger social problems. And so in the 1860s and 1870s, you start to get all of these laws that are outlawing obscenities and pornography and are trying to begin to put some new restrictions on alcohol, that are worried about prostitution. And you also get these new laws about cruelty to animals and cruelty to children. And the idea is basically this. If a man beats his dog, he will soon beat his child. He will soon beat his wife. And that violence and chaos will spill out into society. And so if you can stop a man from beating his dog, you can stop all of those other knock-on effects. And so you get these groups, actually largely led by men. It's going to look very differently by like the early 20th century with the progressive movement, when these are more women-led movements. But men passing new laws that say, actually, the state has a vested interest in how you treat your animals. And that's how you get something like the ASPCA.
I would just say that, as someone who studies the abolitionists, they're a big part of this as well, that they're pushing not just for the abolition of slavery, but of temperance and how children are treated and also how animals are treated. And so there was this belief that if you were an abolitionist, that, you treated your animals kindly, and that slaveholders were often not just abusive to their slaves, but also abusive to their animals, and that this relationship worked in tandem, that the violence fed off one another in terms of animals and their human property. So I don't think people typically associate, animal cruelty or the animal movement with the abolitionists, but they're pretty much at the helm of this movement as well.
That's so interesting. I feel like it probably was way too early for this, but I know that now we oftentimes equate like any sort of child cruelty to animals as an indicator of some sort of larger like mental pathology in some way. But was any of that emergent at that time?
So you don't quite get the psychologizing that you would get later, in part because psychology is an underdeveloped discipline at this point. But you do get the basic idea, which is that cruelty and violence starts small and gets bigger. And that if you can intervene in those earlier moments, you can stop the worsening violence from happening. And so even if you don't necessarily have the studies and the articles and the theories behind it, you do have that same basic idea.
I mentioned these two spheres. There's animals that are used for labor, certainly, in pre-industrial times, but, throughout, obviously, the 19th and 20th centuries as well. And then there's domestic animals. Are there different conversations along those fronts?
Yeah, you do have different conversations in terms of how you're thinking about property and belonging, because animals that are raised for work, and then obviously animals that are raised for food, are all seen as sort of lower forms of property. But as you begin to develop this more holistic idea of family, as children are started to be treated as something special, that doesn't really happen until the late 19th century, when children are held not just as small adults, but as something more sacred and more special, you start to get those ideas bleeding into pets as well. It's not to say that people before the late 19th century didn't love their pets and children, but you just have a different kind of schema for how they fit into this idea of family, which is complicated then, because if pets and children are these sacred parts of family, does the government have the right to intervene? And that becomes the big issue around things like the SPCA. Can you interfere with a man and his property? And then behind the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, does the government have a role in how you raise your children? And the answer for both of those organizations was yes, they do.
When does the anthropomorphizing of pets start to happen?
I think I don't have the exact dates on this, but I think it starts to happen, around the same time, but really more into the 20th century. And much later when you start to get this idea of pets as children. I think I introduced myself as a dog mom earlier. That's a much later development.
I would say, literature is a big part of that. Yeah. So how characters get developed and how animals are used within storytelling. There's some of that in the 19th century, Dickens and things of that nature. But, the way that we see animals as people now has definitely a new meaning, certainly in the 21st century, even more so than the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking back on like my own historical expertise, which is early Hollywood stardom, and how even in the early, like the teens and the 20s, pets began to emerge in the fan magazine features and this sort of thing as an accessory during that time. But it was still, they always were purebreds, first of all. And it was also used as like a demarker of like this sort of, whether you're a hunter, like that was part of your character, or if you were fancy or like Betty Davis, like just different. It was a way to really communicate character. And I think that was a definite shift from the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost a crutch in some sense, but it's like a really effective way to build a character as kind or evil as, have them be nice to an animal or have them be cruel to an animal. But, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's sort of abusive animals, and that fits into, as Kellie, you were saying, obviously like Of Mice and Men later on, right? You see just sort of like characters developed in that way. On this question, though, of kind of how our morality is tied into our treatment of animals, and I'm curious if you feel like there's some element there of it being a gateway towards harder conversations about human morality, right? It just seems like so much of this is like it's easier to have a conversation about how you treat an animal in some way than it is to have a conversation about humans treating other humans.
Oh, totally. And I think there's also a lot of extrapolations that we make about like the way that certain communities, their attitude towards dogs, right? Like that somehow a less civilized community doesn't treat dogs the way that civilized like Americans do. There's a different attitude towards dogs on a lot of Native American reservations out in the West. Like res dogs are just kind of more community property. Like they just are slightly more wild and operate in packs and go from place to place. And that doesn't mean that the people on the reservation don't like dogs. It's just a different attitude towards where dogs live and how you think of ownership too.
Yeah, I think one more recent example of that is certainly the Michael Vick story, when that came out. And it created, it was just such a massive firestorm. And I think certainly the treatment of animals in that story was awful. But I also think that there were rightly lots of questions about, how was it that the country sort of mobilized en masse to be shocked by the way that animals were being mistreated, and it's not able to do that about, the way that humans are mistreated or poverty or war or all these other things, it was just a lot
that's
easier.
A big thorn in the side of the Black community because in a lot of ways it's, obviously Black people have dogs and love dogs and things of that nature, but, the constant use of metaphor or analogy to explain the inhumanity of Black people alongside animals is one that feels very insulting to a lot of people. Like, oh, we don't matter unless the dog matters. Or the backlash. The backlash that Michael Vick received was swift and fierce. And so there was a lot of this sort of double standard about how we treat people, even at the border. If you think about the border crisis and how we think about the treatment of migrant children in cages, and then, the way that we think of animals in cages, there's so many instances, I think, that you can point to the marginalization of people and of animals and see these, discussions or debates taking place.
Yeah, it's interesting when those spaces of dehumanization meet the spaces of the anthropomorphizing of animals, because it does lead to exactly that kind of flattening and dissonance, right? The outrage over animal cruelty that isn't necessarily always matched with outrage over other forms of cruelty as well. Like in, I think, a pre-Black Lives Matter day, you often heard more outrage over like police shooting someone's pet than you would hear in terms of outrage over them shooting people. And I think that it has to do with ideas of culpability too, that there's an innocence that we're willing to impute to animals that we're not willing to impute to humans.
I wonder too how much of this discussion is like Western based or unique to the United States, because I know that, when you travel and you go other places, I think people have different relationships with animals and how they see them. I can't remember what country I was in. I think it was the Gambia, and we saw a little boy and his goat, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at your goat, he's so cute, what's his name? And my friend was like, Dinner. And I was like, oh man. But the way that we have domesticated all animals. I mean, pigs are like common pets, and you see animals that you think would be relegated to different spaces have now become typical family pets. It's just a different conversation, I think, in the West than it is in the rest of the world.
Oh, totally. When I was in Myanmar, I think it was 2017, so just briefly after Myanmar had opened to more broad tourism, and was really very quickly embracing a lot of more westernized styles of living, whether it's the cell phone or KFC in the capital city. But there would always, like in small towns, there would be, you could tell like the person who had the most prestige or the wealth in these smaller villages was someone who had a domesticated pet, right? And was treating what usually are treated as street dogs as like a domesticated animal that was groomed and that was kept behind a fence, right? Which is a very different understanding. The other thing I'll say is that out in the West, like a lot of dogs are not treated in the same way, particularly as more domesticated dogs. Like on a ranch, dogs do not sleep inside, almost as a general rule. Oftentimes dogs have the same name generation after generation, right? Like they are given it's an understanding of the dog and its function, but not that granular particularity that I think that we give super domesticated dogs elsewhere.
Though they did that on The Simpsons too. They had Snowball and Snowball too.
Yes.
I mean, I think that has a lot to do with the historic emergence of pets. It has to do with people's relationship to land, work, and animals. As the country becomes more urban, as fewer and fewer people are working on farms, your relationship to animals changes because they're not part of your workaday life. You're disconnected from the animal to plate pipeline. And so you just have a very different view of animals, a different romanticization of animals, and that leads to more of this anthropomorphizing that we were talking about.
So as we start to wrap up here, let's come back to the late 19th century and talk about the ASPCA a bit. So, Niki, you were painting that picture of a shift towards city living and a sort of change in the larger culture. What are the other markers there? I know there's these private organizations, and I'm curious what sort of role they start to play. But then there's actual legislation that starts to get passed. The first federal animal welfare legislation is in 1873, and it mandates food, water, and rest stops for animals that are being used for labor. But it just seems like there's this big conversation that's breaking out at that moment.
Yeah, there really is. And I think that it is in part because these groups in the 1860s and 1870s see their role as kind of law enforcement in a way. They pass new laws and then they arrest people for cruelty to animals, or they fine people for cruelty to animals. And it, again, as you're pointing out, it's not just pets, but because you're living in a city in the 19th century in which animals are horses that are pulling cars down the street. When there is cruelty to animals that happens in that urban setting, it's very public. And I think that helps to rouse public sentiment against animal cruelty, because you're not necessarily seeing the man beating his horse on a farm. But if someone is beating a horse pulling a trolley in the middle of downtown New York, people see that and there's a real public reaction against it. And that helps to create public support for these new laws and for this new way of thinking of animals as something that the state has a right to protect.
And then one final thought. I mean, I think we should just underscore what you said because it is kind of amazing. But the child welfare comes out of animal welfare. Talk about your master's thesis.
Sure. Well, basically, the idea is you really have to convince people that the government has a right to in the way that people thought of it at the time, interfere in the way that you're raising your child. It really is a new role for the state to intervene in families. And so in many ways, the animal cruelty is an entering wedge because pets and animals are seen sort of on the outer perimeter of family and home. So it's the way that the government starts to enter the home and enter into those relationships. It's not to say that pets are more important, but in a way to say that they're less close to the center of the family. And so it's easier to convince people that the government has a role to play. And I should say these were private organizations that were vested with law enforcement power. It's something that is kind of sketchy. And a lot of this was done in ways that promoted social control by upper and middle class white men into immigrant families. So I don't want to paint this as a purely beneficent kind of society, but it would lay the groundwork for more beneficent societies and ultimately lays the groundwork not just for animal welfare and animal rights organizations, but for child cruelty organizations, which would become much, much more important in the 20th century.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it in particular because I think the alarm clock of one of Anne's dogs is going off.
It did.
So who is that? Is that which one?
That's Steve.
Is that Peggy? That was Steve.
That's
okay,
Steve.
great. All right. So there's your proof. Okay. Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you as always.
My pleasure.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Anne Helen Petersen, thank you so much for doing this. And tell folks a little bit about what you're up to. I know you do a million things.
I write full time for my newsletter called Culture Study, which you can find by just Googling my name and newsletter.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in the description for this episode as well. But thank you so much for doing this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at thisdaypod.com. Thanks again to everyone who has reached out with comments and questions and potential topics. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.